Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here now for this panel. I'm really excited about this conversation. Well, not just because of the panelists we get to hear from, but also because I am certain that the practical and philosophical aspects of DeFi are going to be a key conversation over the next year. It's a debate that not only gets to the heart of crypto ethos, but also one that will shape the potential impact of DeFi on the macro landscape. I mean, I could go on about this for ages, but we're short on time. So a brief round of introductions. I'll go first. I'm Noelle Acheson, here on behalf of CoinDesk. I started researching crypto markets back in 2014, a very long time ago, and I'm more recently focusing on the overlap between the crypto and the macro landscapes, how one will impact the other. Candace, want to go next?
I'm Candace Kelly. I'm the Chief Legal Officer for the Stellar Development Foundation, so I have the privilege of leading both the legal and policy teams at the foundation and getting to interact with lots of lawyers and lots of policymakers and lawmakers. And I've been with the foundation since 2019. But prior to that, my former life, I was a federal prosecutor. So, bit of a transition.
A little bit.
Coy?
Coy Garrison. I'm a partner at Steptoe & Johnson, based in Washington, D.C., and I'm a member of their blockchain and cryptocurrency practice. I advise clients on regulatory counseling and public policy counseling on crypto matters. And prior to joining Steptoe last year, I spent about 10 years at the U.S. SEC, including as counsel to Commissioner Hester Peirce, or Crypto Mom, as she's often referred to.
I'm Andrew McFarlane. I'm one of the co-founders and CTO of Validation Cloud. We're a Web3 infrastructure company with 3 core pillars of our platform: staking, Node API, and data as a service. And we've recently partnered with Stellar on our Node API product to help connectivity for folks on an RPC level into Sorbonne, both for testnet, which is live this week for us, and then become mainnet at the end of the year. Our platform was built for global scale, high throughput, low latency, similar to a Cloudflare for Web3, and so bringing performance for Web3 users.
Awesome, thank you. And like I said, this is an excellent panel to talk about DeFi because we have technology expertise as well as legal and network expertise. So you can see why I'm particularly excited. Now, the title of the panel is Dimensions of DeFi. And not a lot of people know this about me, but I'm a maths geek. I actually even have a degree in applied mathematics. Not that I remember a thing, because it was a very long time ago. But looking at this through the maths lens, dimensions for me are something that you measure. And to measure something, you need to be able to define it. And in DeFi, that is not as easy as it sounds. So let's start there. Candace, I'll start with you. What do we mean by DeFi? And while you're at it, what does DeFi mean for Stellar?
All right, well, it's a tough crowd for me to answer that. I have a bunch of builders and engineers who probably can answer this better than I can. But my job is to make sure that I can have these conversations with people who are not engineers. I'm try to be a bridge person. So I actually want to start with saying what it's not. Okay. Right? So I think that sometimes people put everything decentralized into one bucket and say that's DeFi. And I would say that's not correct. Decentralized blockchain network is not DeFi. Peer-to-peer transactions are not DeFi. DeFi, to me, is the financial products and services that are built on those decentralized networks that offer financial services that are traditionally intermediated by a human or an entity, but in DeFi, there's a smart contract or some other algorithm that is driving that. So to me, that it's like automated market makers and lending protocols and borrowing protocols and things to that effect. And I'm sure that some folks may disagree with me, but
the service rather than the technology.
Exactly. And so for us in the Stellar ecosystem, it's really an exciting time because we all know here that there's a lot of talk and a lot of specific demos and things about the Sorbonne network, which is bringing, if it's voted in by the validators before the end of the year, bringing smart contract capability to the Stellar ecosystem. So it's very exciting times for us.
That's fascinating. Andrew, I want to ask you, what do users understand by DeFi, and do you see a difference between retail and institutional understanding of the concept?
It's an excellent question. So I think at first, I think users see DeFi in general, there's many different ways, but I think one way to look at it is at its core, when the settlement of financial instruments or contracts is governed by a decentralized network. I think what's unifying, perhaps, to start about retail and institution, I think is for the desire for lower transaction fees in order to make their settlements, as well as higher throughput. I think there's been a number of great innovations on the Sorbonne layer in order to make that a reality for Stellar and a great place for DeFi. I think where there may be some differences in that view is, I think, a spectrum of transparency. I think retail users tend, not for everybody, but tend to want maximum transparency for their transactions and those of the ecosystem, where institutions may want a little bit less, particularly around the metadata of those transactions, in order to maybe have some privacy around their strategies or the identity of their clients. So I think one interesting technology in DeFi to look forward to in this divide is zero knowledge proofs. It's been in the press a lot around scalability, but it also has implications for things like confidential smart contracts, which will have relevance in that distinction.
And it's one thing what the people want, is another thing what they're allowed to have, and this is where the legal understanding of DeFi comes in. Koi,
Absolutely.
What is the legal understanding of DeFi from where you sit?
Sure. If I had to summarize in one word, I would probably say uncertain, right? I mean, I think there's a real disconnect here. We're talking about DeFi, what it means, and even within the industry, there's no quite one definition or agreement. But at its core, probably the common denominator is a lack of an intermediary, right? Of relying on technology to enable trust between parties. And from a legal perspective, we're not used to that. We're used to identifying a specific party, entity, or individual that can be held responsible for these activities. So I think, from a legal perspective, you see it at the regulator side, but also judges, just lawyers in private practice. There's this balancing act of how do we put this into existing legal structures that we have, and that is not always a very good fit as we see.
What do you think is the biggest barrier to that happening?
So I think a couple barriers. One, I think it's a lack of imagination from regulators. So what I mean by that is maybe a good example is the recent IOSCO report on DeFi and the list of recommendations that came out earlier this year. It's a very interesting read. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. But I think the underlying theory of the report was same activity, same risk, same regulatory outcome. And that's what's guiding regulators globally. And we can get into specifics on individual countries in the US and the like, but I think if you take that approach, that can't be the end point. I think the next step, the biggest barrier is, how do we get the same regulatory outcome by leveraging the existing technology? There's an obvious mismatch here of holding individual DAO members liable for actions that they voted on. So how do we still ensure protections and that there's responsible actors in the space, but maybe tweaking the existing regulations? And I think that's kind of the missing step right now.
And especially complicated when, after all, regulators regulate outcomes, not technologies, and here the boundaries are getting a bit blurred, and especially when the same actions, same consequences, the actions themselves are being defined as we go along. And speaking of as we go along, I think we should take a look at how DeFi has evolved over the past few years. That will give us perhaps an idea of where it will go from here, how it will continue to evolve. Now, Andrew, what big changes have you seen in DeFi utility over the past couple of years?
Yeah, a great question. So I think there's been a number of innovations to enable further utility. A few that are top of mind, one in particular that many folks have spoken about today, which is stablecoins, which I think has been a tremendous innovation. Let's say 3, 4, 5 years ago, with lack of stablecoins and trading on decentralized exchanges, you often had to remain exposed to crypto as part of your trading strategy. So I think stablecoins have made settlement much more sustainable, but also allowed for more dollars to stay within the Web3 ecosystem. A couple others that are really important and innovations that we're seeing this week, especially in the Stellar ecosystem. One is interoperability. So there's advances not only at the layer 1 level, but taking more of a application-specific view of blockchains. There will be certain chains that are good for certain use cases, and there may be others for, let's say gaming or other use cases where you want portability of your assets. So being able to have bridges, like Axelar, which I think is here this week, is tremendously important. And one more to note is the evolution of wallet technology, generally making that more user-friendly, but also helping DeFi developers and wallets sort of focus on their core innovations. And there's been a lot of middleware built between those to make it, ease the developer experience, but also make it more secure for users.
And I think people very much overlook how hard that is. I mean, we know of some very large bridge hacks, for instance, and we totally forgot that bridges are not just a vulnerability, they're entirely new technology themselves. Same with wallets. It's hard because we're still figuring out what role wallets play in identity and giving us access to the services that are evolving. And Candace, I want to ask you something about, because the landscape that you see is very diverse. And I want to ask you about how important is DeFi? I mean, to those of us in this world, it's, the pace of change is rapid and bumpy as well, but, DeFi is huge and there's so much going on, it absorbs a lot of our attention. But outside of crypto, is DeFi relevant? Do people care?
Yes, people care, but I do think it's really important to get some perspective. And I had the privilege of going to Eurofee a couple weeks ago and have been at a couple of conferences here and sort of gotten a little bit out of the crypto universe that those of us in this crowd often find ourselves in the forest and in the trees and pulling out to the forest. It's good to remind ourselves that the TVL in DeFi is $40 billion. Sounds like a big number for me.
Yeah. Not nothing.
Crypto is $1 trillion. And if you look at the larger, it's hundreds of trillions of dollars. So DeFi, as I have defined it today, is really quite small. But at the same time, when you listen to financial, regulators and foreign ministers, it's a small and very confusing and blinking red light because there's a lot of risk. And so to me, it is really important to recognize that their job is to worry about consumer protection and safe and stable markets. So if there's a flashing light that seems to be risking all of that, the industry's challenge is to make sure that we pull out the utility and the value, just like in Stellar Classic, we've been doing that for years, right? With remittances and with humanitarian aid and the real world use cases. And I think that's really critical because it is very small. And I think there is an understanding from regulators when you actually get down to sit down and talk to them that it's a pretty small market right now, but it's going to grow. And it's not been on a,
bumpy.
It's been on a bumpy ride, but I think that it's really helpful to make sure that we once in a while pick our heads up and recognize that it's small, it needs room to grow, but at the same time we need to be looking out for what the regulators are concerned about and what their responsibility is. And we all rely on them for those things in our day-to-day life, for consumer protection, for market stability. So I think it's important to
Yeah, maybe we can
keep
all
some
get
perspective.
Yeah, and we can all get behind consumer protection. After all, we know some of the big risks are there. But you touched on something very interesting, so it's like divergence here. And that is a lot of what the regulators have to look at, and a lot of the big frustrations and pain points in the industry are because we assume that DeFi is about markets, it's about trading, it's about ease of access. But you mentioned that it's not just about that, and this is something that Stellar has been spending a lot of time on.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it's sitting in my role, and I'm sure all these different stages that people have very different perspectives. But Stellar Classic, as we like to call it, has been very focused on remittances and reaching people who don't have the same access to financial services that some of the rest of us do. And the next wave is once we've kind of solved that problem. Like, what are you going to, remittances are great, but then you need the next step and the next step. You need to build your financial future. And so a lot of the exciting projects that I've seen that are on testnet, FutureNet so far in Sorbonne are going to be that next wave. And so making sure that as the builders here are beginning to build and think about that there is that interconnectivity and the same thought that's going into building wallets that are more user-friendly and making sure that if I lose my key, I don't, lose all of my crypto because there are some solutions that take care of that. Building in identity solutions. And so as we move more and more towards this Web3 notion of individuals having more control and less trust on intermediaries, that the tools are in place. And I think that that's the exciting thing for me in Sorbonne and those solutions that are being built. And there are endless possibilities, but I think it always has to be kept in perspective of it's not disconnected from the core payments and financial infrastructure that I think blockchain has provided to so many people.
New type of tools emerging for new types of transactions and new types of markets. I do not envy the regulator's job on this. Koi, how has the regulatory attitude changed beyond the obvious chill that we are very familiar with? How has the regulatory attitude changed towards crypto?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a good regulatory environment for the industry right now, right? I mean, I think the posture of most regulators is you need to justify to us why you should exist. Why should we not shut you down? And I think that's a very, very difficult place to be in. I mean, I think this is obviously stemming from FTX and the egregious behavior that occurred in that situation. But I think it's done a couple things. I mean,
which is not DeFi. Sorry, just to make sure.
That's right. That's right.
Part of our job too is to make sure that FTX is not put in the DeFi bucket. Sorry.
Indeed.
Carry on, Koi.
Well, and it's those distinctions are not zeroed in on by policymakers, as you know. It's something that's really important to keep up on, and it's really given the green light of the regulators, certainly in the U.S., the SEC, the CFTC, to expand their authorities to be very aggressive in defining the outer bounds of their jurisdiction, right? So now they have a investor protection mandate that they can point to FTX and say, if we don't act, this is going to happen. We're allowed to go in. We can expand our authority this way. And it's, the unfortunate side of that is that if these agencies are successful in shutting down different projects and different protocols, then we miss out on all the great things you just talked about. And it's really throwing the baby out with the bathwater in many ways. And, it's also unfortunate because I think as we're finding both in the traditional crypto space and maybe starting in the DeFi space as well, regulators' interpretation of their authority is not the same as a independent judge's interpretation of the agency's authority, right? So you've seen that in the Ripple case with the SEC, where a federal judge in the Southern District of New York has a very different opinion of how the Howey test applies to crypto assets than the US SEC. You see that in the DeFi world. The CFTC brought 3 enforcement actions against DeFi protocols. Those were settlements. No judge weighed in on that. That's a very expansive read of what it means to be an offerer of retail commodity transactions under the CEA. The very same week, there was a federal judge that in the Uniswap private class action litigation that determined that the U.S. securities laws was not applicable to activity that was occurring there. So you get uneven outcomes in this environment, and it's a very bad place to be. And I think you really need to lean into the policymakers in every jurisdiction need to step up. And in order for them to do that, it's really on the industry to vocalize and to share what is important, to share best practices, to share how do we mitigate the risks that exist in this space.
And to be fair, the regulators really haven't had to grapple, at least for a very, very long time, with such a fluid technology and with such fluid applications and with the speed that everything is diving into. And this is a good segue into the next topic I'd like to touch on, which is DeFi and regulation, which is important to everyone. And Koi, I'll continue with you. And then I want to ask each of you the same question. Can DeFi be regulated? And what should regulators focus on if you think the answer is yes?
Sure. I mean, I think the answer is absolutely yes. Anything can be regulated. The question is, how can it be regulated efficiently and smartly, right? And I think there's a lot of different angles. And again, the IASCO report, I really recommend everyone in the industry read it, because I think you'll recognize some hard truths in there, and I think you'll recognize some things that you probably question. But it has a laundry list of risks and everything. And I think, to me, the ones that stand out for policymakers of where we need to focus energies, at least right out of the gate, is when you see a country like North Korea engaging in hacks, engaging in different DeFi protocols, like that is going to be a problem for any jurisdiction. So focusing on how to comply with sanctions laws, it has got to be a big one. And then pure cybersecurity. That's something that I think regulators across the world look to the industry for guidance and lead on. The numbers are staggering for DeFi right now of hacks and everything. So I think those two areas of focusing on industry-led best practices would be a great starting point.
Candace, what's your take?
Yeah, well, I think of regulation as filling the gap between the user and, in traditional finance, the intermediary. So if I give my money to a bank, I want somebody looking out to make sure that those humans who are working at the bank are not being corrupt, worst case, lazy, negligent, whatever it is. And that's why there are these regulators, and there's a pretty big gap, because I'm turning over everything. And so I think what the regulators need to do to be able to figure this out is not say, that's the system, let's push DeFi into that system. It's, let's look at DeFi and say, how is this technology closing that gap? Because there are questions that are immutable because they are on a ledger, right? We don't have to worry about whether a transaction happened or didn't happen and whether the records are correct. Regulator doesn't have to worry about that because they can look at the immutable ledger of the blockchain. And so I think that that's really the key is the creative regulators that you said maybe there aren't so many of them, but we'll find them.
They're out there.
But to really understand what this technology is bringing, and in some cases how the technology itself can help. I mean, the immutable ledger, I mean, programmable assets that can have KYC embedded or zero knowledge proofs. There are various things that the gaps that the regulator is there to fill on behalf of the consumer are not the same gaps. And that's the challenge that the regulators, that our job is to help them to understand that, but to help them to make sure that they are fulfilling that outcome of protecting consumers, protecting markets in a way that makes sense for this new development in the technology.
Identify the gaps, measure them, dimensions, definitions, very hard. Andrew, what's your take? Can DeFi be regulated?
Yeah, it absolutely can. I think one important distinction in this conversation, and it came up with FTX, is centralization is not inherently a problem with DeFi if engineered in the correct way. So I think a couple distinctions is one is you can have centralized providers that help facilitate interactions for users of DeFi without their ability to change the integrity of that transaction. So I think that's important to consider. And second is the distinction between decentralization and a non-custodial hold on assets. And so again, it's very possible to help steward a transaction, but not actually be able to move those assets or hold those assets in the private key of the user or move those assets in a way that the user did not intend. So I think it's important to focus on that element because when you do have a sort of custodial relationship, you can hurt a large swath of consumers, all at once, like we saw in the case of FTX. And usually those practices lead to sort of fractional reserves and things of that nature to make the business model work. What I do think is important and is one step in the right direction is something that's top of mind for us. We recently went through our SOC 2 audit, which is high security standards that come from the Web 2 universe. And while those are best practices in Web 2, they don't necessarily have parameters that are specific to Web 3. So I think there's work that needs to be done to bring in, let's say for smart contract development, into the fold of those audits so that there's more certification around the protocols that get launched, and you have that stamp of certification when you interact and feel more secure as a user interacting with those types of protocols.
And you touched on something that I think is another fundamental misunderstanding, and that is decentralization is not binary. There are various degrees of it, and the regulators will get comfortable with various degrees on it. Moving on to, building now. I want to ask you something. What can builders be doing better with the relationship with regulators?
Yeah, absolutely. So in line with those standards, I think builders could be working more with auditors, with regulators to come up with pragmatic standards. So I think a good Web 2 analogy for this is something like the PCI DSS standard. So for those who are not familiar, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which is actually brought by a council of credit card companies to help avoid fraud and abuse for payment processors. And I think something like that model or a similar framework would be helpful, or bringing into standards into the SOC 2 framework in order for everybody to be aligned on best practices and have certifications that folks can be ensure that there's security when they're interacting with the protocol. I think too, there's opportunities for wallets and browsers, like going back to the Web 2 analogy, where you have a green stamp of, hey, today in Web 2, when you browse the internet, that you have a secure connection, and that it prompts you if you're dealing with what they think could be an unsafe site and that's trying to steal your information. I think similarly, if we have those types of certifications, and when a user tries to interact, that centralized gateway or browser wallet can actually help say, hey, look, this is a whitelisted smart contract that is safe for you as a user to interact with. So those are a couple ideas of how DeFi builders could come together.
And to users, Candace, where do you see the most growth coming over the next year? Institutions or individuals?
Well, I don't know exactly. I'm not good at predicting these things.
No crystal ball? No crystal ball with you today?
But I think, well, first I wanted to just pick up on something that Andrew was saying, which is I think that all of these are great suggestions and things, and your question was, what can builders do? But I think the other piece that we really need to think about is what is the role of, whether it's government or others in the policy space, in educating financial literacy, right? Yeah. Financial literacy is something that if we are moving to more and more decentralized and more autonomy in how we are handling, whether it's our private information or our finances. Right now, we rely on regulators to be that paternalistic person who's going to make sure that I, as a consumer, am safe. I think as we expect in the Web3 evolution to take on more of that responsibility, we also have to take on more of a responsibility of what is it that I am doing? What is it that I don't have to say, oh, it's a bank and it's regulated by the United States and it's fine. I need to understand what that check mark is. I need to understand that security is an important thing, and so I do think that also may be part of the process of the mind shift of what the role of regulators and governments is, because that is the way we're moving, right? Like everyone wants to go to Web3 and have more control, more autonomy. So I'm not at all answering your question, but I wanted to jump in on that.
Such a good point.
And I think, though, that to answer very briefly your question, where is the growth going to come from? I think it's going to be dependent on that very question of who can get comfortable more quickly, because there is a lot of education to understand and to feel there is this trustlessness, but you have to understand enough to know that you can trust this protocol, you can trust this different way of interacting with a financial service. So it depends on the builders, how they interact and how they educate the user base, whether it's individuals or institutions.
And how the regulators react to all of that as well. That is such a good point, because also you touched on something that I personally find very fascinating, and that is how definitions are changing. It's not just about measurement, it's about understanding what regulators are supposed to do and how far beyond their borders is their responsibility, and what is the responsibility of builders, because they're not necessarily the same as those that develop the applications, as we've seen, that can get in trouble. It's the philosophical aspect of the DeFi that I mentioned in the very beginning. It is fascinating. And you know, while we could go on and on for this for ages, we are running out of time. We only have a few minutes. So I do want to move on to the final section that I have here, which is looking ahead. Because again, crystal balls notwithstanding, looking ahead is one of the most fascinating aspects of this industry, because we are all here for change. Now, Andrew, I want to throw something to you. What does DeFi maturation look like? And you know, how will we know when we get there?
Sure. So I think a few things. One, I think Candace was alluding to this a little bit in more liquidity in DeFi protocols from more traditional financial institutions.
Yeah.
I think from this point, large banks have treated their foray into Web3 as more of a proof of concept and a toe dip. But there's several orders of magnitude between total value locked in DeFi and, let's say, the bond market. And so there's a long way to go. I think a second important point, and I think a lot of builders here at the conference are working on this problem, is there's a lot of exposure to US dollars, or a lot of liquidity in US dollar denominated stablecoins. I think the future and maturation is more foreign currencies that are supported with high liquidity. I think that will be great for the ecosystem. Let's say euro denomination or Chinese yuan as being something to look forward to as we mature.
It may become inevitable, especially when MiCA kicks in and US dollar stablecoins are not given the authorization. It's going to be fascinating. And Akoy, what could slow down the maturation, in your opinion, or speed it up?
I think one thing that could help speed up maturation would certainly be a change in arguments made by the industry. So when I think of what a maturing DeFi world looks like, I think we move beyond arguments such as we're decentralized, so the law doesn't apply to us, right? We move beyond law is code. We move beyond this concept that a DAO doesn't need a legal wrapper. Legal wrappers exist to protect people that are engaged in commerce. There's benefits to this. So I think if we move beyond these positions that I think ideologically, hey, I'm actually aligned with, I'm there, but I think they're just not that practical in reality, and we start having more nuanced discussions about what is the proper role of regulation as we're evolving and taking on more responsibility, where should the focus be, and the like. So I think that those arguments, well directed at serious engagement, there's a lot of opportunities to be engaged across the board. The IOSCO recommendations are out for public comment right now. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is looking to change the definition of exchange to cover DeFi protocols. The CFTC has a number of advisory committees that are actively taking comments and engaging on this. So I think serious, nuanced, substantive conversation, debate, and being willing to show up and get into a detailed conversation and not just relying on platitudes about decentralization or code as law.
That does sound awesome, I must say.
And since you've mentioned IOSCO so many times, I hope you're here tomorrow, because I have a fireside chat with the Deputy Secretary General of IOSCO. So we will talk about that report and the recommendations. October 19th is the deadline for comments. So
make sure everyone shows up for that chat as well. It's going to be good. Now, Candace, what's the roadmap for Stellar? What are you most looking forward to celebrating?
Well, obviously, there's going to be a vote coming out, and maybe Soroban will get voted in. And to me, I think what's really exciting about Soroban and the way that the Stellar ecosystem has approached DeFi and smart contracts is that we have a lot of others to learn from. So I know that we're not going to have any audience questions, and if any of you come and ask me questions, I'm going to point you to the right person, because some of the things I'm going to say I know, but I can't explain. But things like EVM, which was the reason why Curve had its exploits, that's not a thing in Sorbonne. Like the bright people in the the engineers have figured that out. And there are, state bloat. I know Garrison was upstairs earlier today, and he explained that to me, believe it or not. I totally understood it. I can't read, but being able to think about those issues from a technology standpoint, and then some of the other issues that Andrew mentioned in terms of making sure that we are prioritizing security. We're prioritizing, I mean, we certainly, we give a lot of grants, and we have prioritized, like, hey, maybe you're a startup, maybe you're young and new at this, but you need to have funding to prioritize security, to prioritize legal advice. And so that's something that we are very committed to in the Stellar Development Foundation, to see if we can learn from the fact that bridges are one of the most vulnerable pieces. So I'm excited to see how this ecosystem learns from all the work that's been done in other ecosystems and takes it to the next level, and really makes that connection between the Stellar Classic and the remittances and the payments, and brings more opportunity in a safe way, even if the regulators don't catch up and come in and try and fill that gap themselves, that the ecosystem can be creative about filling that gap and making it smaller and smaller, the need for the regulator to come in and do that.
Because what you're highlighting is the importance of diversity, not just in the underlying technologies, but in the priorities, the focuses, the applications, the user base, etc. It's certainly fascinating, hard to get our heads around. Now, we only have less than 3 minutes left, or 2 minutes left, but I want to ask each of you a very quick question. Looking ahead, let's imagine that we are doing this panel again a year from now. What will have changed other than my hair having grown back? Andrew, you go first.
Yeah, I think a lot's going to change with the launch of Sorbonne mainnet. So I think a lot of the conversation will be around the performance, the security, and the utility advantages that protocol launch enables, bringing the interoperability with Stellar Classic, the assets, and bringing new utility there. For DeFi and other applications is tremendous. So I'm sure there's going to be a great conversation around Sorbonne and the users, old and new, that are brought in based on that performance. And then, I'll add in for us at Validation Cloud, we're excited to play a role. Part of the performance and security is obviously at the layer 1 level with Sorbonne, but another often forgot layer of scalability and performance is the gateways through which users access that layer 1. And so we've built a global scale, low latency platform for connecting users in not only the US, but Europe, Africa, Asia, with the same level of performance and connectivity. And so I think that's an important role for the future, and we're excited to be part of the ecosystem.
That is pretty exciting. Koi, what do you think will have changed between now and a year from now?
I hate to be the downer, but I do not think that the regulatory status will change a year from now, certainly not within the United States. I think it's a long game, so I think people just need to manage their expectations. But that being said, this is a global industry. Yeah. There are a lot of other jurisdictions, and I would love to see and think there's a good chance of other jurisdictions standing up and having very progressive, interesting ideas on how to regulate this space.
Sobering but fair. Yeah. Candace, what do you think
we'll
be talking about a year from now?
I'll be a little bit more positive than that, Koi, because I have more faith in you and me and Tina and others who are in this space that even if the regulations are not set in stone a year from now, I hope and anticipate that the conversation is going to be more mature. Some of the concepts that we've talked about we're going to be able to find those creative regulators. We're going to be able to, and we're going to have all of these projects that are bringing the real world utility, which really was what changed the conversation with Stellar Classic. Yeah. In my world, in talking to policymakers, right, the more real world use cases and not trading and speculation that we're able to talk about, the more you can actually have a real conversation. And so I think that there are builders at this conference, there are builders broadly in the Stellar ecosystem who are going to help make our jobs easier and to narrow that gap between how the regulators are thinking about it and policymakers, and how we envision the world. So that's my positive note to end on.
The emerging tapestry. What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for that. I hope you all have found this half as interesting as I have. This is one of the most fascinating conversations I've had for a very long time, and I thank you very much. A hand for our panelists, please.